Okay, so we are recording now. So now we are at the stage where all of us should have a B2B connection created, SFTP connection created, and we should be able to access that SFTP connection using FileZilla, WinSCP, or any third-party tools, right? Now, in the last call when we did that, we also dropped a file into SFTP's inbox folder. And I believe we dropped PO in X12 format. So the B2B connection that we created, choreography type for that connection was X12. Because of that, we dropped the file into inbox XTT inside XTT underscore X12 folder. And when we did that, we also talked about some of the steps that happen after we drop a file into inbox folder in XTT. So the step one we talked about, as soon as we drop the file, the first step that B2B does is it is the identifying the transaction type, right? So if the choreography is well defined, if the file format is well understood by B2B, which is for X12 and EDIFACT format, XTT can look into the file and find out the format, read the format, and extract the transaction type information from the inbound document itself. If the transaction types are generic, they do not follow a standard, it can be CSV, XML, and so on, then we drop the files in inbox folder under the subfolders which are created with the correct transaction name. So for example, if we want to drop an XML file, purchase order XML file, we will drop it under inbox, MPC underscore purchase underscore order folder. And if it is X12 or EDIFACT, we will drop it in their respective folder. So there will be just one folder where we will drop it, and XTT itself would be able to identify the transaction type. Step number two was, once the XTT is able to understand the transaction type, then what it would do is you have already dropped a transaction to a B2B connection. That B2B connection has a transform set associated. Within the transform sets, there are separate transform for each transaction type. So B2B already knows the transaction type, so it will know which transform to execute. And that inbound transform will get executed and the file will get converted to the canonical. Third step that B2B does is, from that canonical, B2B identifies sender and recipient information. Okay. Now, sender and recipient information, we talked about how it is identified. If you have X12 folder, there are two sections of X12 folder file. Sender and receiver, those IDs will be taken, and then B2B will compare the recipient ID. It will go and look for the link setting object. It will find the recipient ID there, and from there, the network node that is associated with that ID type and value would be selected as receiver identifier, and sender would be the B2B connection where we send the document. That B2B connection is associated with a sender network node ID. So if you have any questions on all of that, you can just go through the previous sessions because we talked about it in detail. Then the final step was routing, when B2B tries to route the transaction based on the sender and receiver and the mint owner, right? So those are the processing steps that would be followed. Last step is the post-processing transform step. Now, post-processing transform step is where we add information about a process network, which process network the transaction should go to, and what type of transaction it is. Whether it is transaction is meant for external manufacturing purchase order or commerce purchase order, and so on. And the final step is delivery, where the document is delivered to the Mint application. So remember, we are discussing the inbound processing steps. Now, once all of this gets completed, so in the last call, we saw that we had not created a link setting object, and because of which B2B was not able to identify the receiver and we were getting errors, but we resolved that error as well. Now, if all of it is successful so far, then what happens is the transaction, now you should be able to see the transaction. If you log into your Opus company, go to main menu, click on My Networks, of course, for the owner company, My Networks, select the process network, click on Go, and then under business transaction, all transaction, business transaction, you should be able to see that transaction inbound. It might get successful, it might get failed, it might stop because of some other configurations that we need to do on partner side. But if this is all successful so far, you should be able to see the transaction appearing on the Mint UI. Okay. So in today's session, we will talk about what happens. So we talked about what happens when transaction from an external system or ERP comes to Opus Gateway application, which is XTT, and then B2B processes the transaction, routes it to the correct company and process network. Now Mint has received this transaction, right? So what happens within Mint? What are the processes that happen within Mint? And then what happens on the outbound side? So these are the two things that we are going to talk about today. As usual, you have any question, you can put it in chat or you can ask those questions. And we have all the previous recordings available, so you can go back to that anytime and work on any troubleshooting step that you want to. Apart from that, we have this Mint Q&A call, daily call, so you can join that call if you have any specific questions in setting it up. Okay, so the next step, when a transaction has reached to Mint, what happens here? So we will today talk about Mint, the application itself, and then another concept called as transaction workflow. Now, at a high level, transaction workflow is all the steps that through which a transaction will go within Mint, and then it will get delivered outbound. Right? So you will see these steps also have been partitioned so that we know what processing is happening on the document at a given point of time, right? Now, if you see the diagram below, this is the workflow. The workflow state starts from begin, and then you see one arrow from begin goes directly to prepare inbound. And of course, I'll explain it in some time, what are these different steps. But then there is another arrow that starts from begin, goes to draft, to submitted, and then eventually to prepare inbound. Once prepare inbound happens, there is a step called process inbound. As the name suggests, this is where all the processing is happening for the inbound transaction. And then when processing has happened, Canonical is consumed by the Mint application. Mint can understand those applications and create an object or a transaction in Mint. And then the outbound stage starts. So you will have prepare outbound, process outbound, and conclude outbound. So first of all, these are different workflow stages. These are the stages that you will even see on the Mint user interface in the first column that will be called as the state. I think it is called state, right? This is what you will see here, there, okay? Now, so the first step, first two stages that you see here from after begin, draft and submitted. These two states, workflow states, are only applicable when a user creates a transaction from the Mint user interface. So if you go to Mint user interface, you navigate to PO, you fill in all the information there and click on submit. That's the purchase order that has been created in draft mode, right? So it is just saved, not yet submitted to any partner. And then of course, from draft mode, you can then click on edit the purchase order or any transaction if you need to, and then submit it so that Mint can start processing the transaction and deliver it to the partner. All the other stages will start. The other arrow that you see on the top, the red one, which is called default. Now this stage is applicable when a transaction is received from B2B. So when a transaction is received via B2B, the transaction skips the draft and submitted mode and directly lands into the prepare inbound stage. Okay. Now, after prepare inbound stage, all the stages are normal. So they are applied to all the transactions. Okay. Now, these logics that you see here, two exceptions, one is here, one is here. We already talked about the default one. So this one, submitted to draft, is another stage that has been added. If, let's say, you submit a transaction from the UI, you get some sort of error, you can then edit the transaction, change some value and resubmit it, right? So system will allow you to go back from submitted to draft mode so that you can edit some information and resubmit the information. Okay. Now this is only applicable when a transaction is created via user interface. The last stage here talks about when we have created a message, it was delivered outbound, but on outbound side, maybe the receiving system could not process the message, right? And we need to redeliver the outbound transaction to the system. So this is where you can navigate to Mint, change the transaction workflow status, and then you can redeliver the already delivered transaction whenever there are exception scenarios. Okay. Now, if you see here, the transition made by MPC or Mint from the UI logic. This is the transaction workflow logic that is followed. So this is the red arrows that you see here. And then backend logic has created this transition as well, where you can reprocess a certain transaction if it fails for some reason to deliver outbound. So actually system has tried delivering it outbound, but maybe on outbound side, there were some errors because of which it was not able to get processed into the receiving system. Okay. Now, with all of these stages, a transaction goes through, there are certain activities that happens on, and as of now, I'm saying transaction, but after some time, I will try and change the word to object, right? So there are some actions or some work that happens on the transaction. So we will see that in detail as well, that which are the different stages and what happens in those different stages, what happens on that transaction. Okay. So before we get into that, again, some basic slides. So the EDI that we are going to refer here, we are going to refer EDI as the not specific to the format like X12 or EDIFACT. We are saying only a transaction, electronic data interchange. So it can be any format which is being interchanged electronically, right? So that is what Mint is going to do. Now, example, as we know, purchase order, that is what we are doing. Purchase order will have a reference number called as a purchase order number. So with every transaction, there might be some sort of reference transaction number. Okay. Now, we'll talk about what are business objects in the next slide. But what Mint will do is it will take one reference and it will try to create a sort of envelope which will be referred to as object in our future slide, right? Now, what might happen is customers might start sending multiple transactions with the same purchase order number. Okay, so you keep the purchase, which might not be a practical use case, but they can certainly do so, right? So you can send same purchase order number and you can send multiple transactions based on that. Mint will not do any attempt to check whether the transaction exists in the system or not. If you send a new transaction, it is, if you send another file, it is a new transaction for Mint. So it will keep on creating the new transactions and it will not refer to the earlier purchase order number or reference number or so on. Okay, so same file, you send it 10 times, there will be 10 different transactions created on Mint with the same reference number, same purchase order number. Okay, so it is now customers will have to share these transactions wisely. Okay, so we kept talking about object every time when we discuss, we kept talking about object knowingly or unknowingly. Now let's discuss what is an object. Okay. Now, so first of all, whatever transaction B2B received, so this was the purchase order file that B2B received initially when we dropped it on the inbox folder under XTT underscore X12, right? So that is a B2B transaction that was done with the system. Okay. With every B2B transaction that is done with the system, Mint will create an object, transition object, that will be called as MPC business transaction object. Okay. Now, this is very important that there is one-to-one relationship between all the transactions that are received by B2B and the object that Mint creates. So as I was talking earlier, you send 10 different files with the same PO number, same file. These are 10 different B2B transactions because you dropped that file 10 times on SFTP, right? So that means there will be 10 separate objects created for Mint as well. Right, and this is what we meant when we said that the 10 transaction will appear on the Mint user interface also. Okay, now this object that gets created, it has these parts. So if you'll see, first part is B2B transaction, which has all the details which we talked about from starting. It has details about what sort of transaction it is, who is sender, who is receiver, what is the process network, what is the subtype, and so on, right? That is the first part, that is B2B transaction part. It will also have all the transaction detail, the actual transaction detail that the file has. So ship from, ship to, sold to, and those sort of information. It will also have some sort of UX attribute. Now, these are the attributes or these are the fields that you see on the user interface, Mint user interface when you log in, right? So every transaction will have a base type, which will be B2B transaction and transaction detail, and also a subtype, which is a specific UI attributes or a specific UI that values that you are going to see on Mint screen. Okay. Now, this subtype is the actual representation of the document on the user interface. This is what tells system that it is a purchase order for external manufacturing or purchase order for commerce and so on, right? Because this is where if you log into the system, navigate to left-hand menu and you see all the roles. So this is an object which has one part of it is base type and then one part of it is subtype. This subtype information is set up using your post-processing transforms. Okay, that is one of the information that goes in or gets added through the post-processing transforms. Okay, let me see. I thought I invited someone from product on this call, and I don't know if they were able to join, but if they are, if someone from product is on the call, you can feel free to speak anytime if you want to provide some more detail which you think would be useful for us. Okay. So please feel free to speak up. Okay. Otherwise, I'll just keep on going and I'll assume that whatever I'm saying is correct. Okay, so Mint transaction workflow. Now this diagram provides an actual overview of what happens to a transaction when it is sent via XTT. And we saw this part in our last call, right? So this is the part that we discussed in our last call. The document was placed in XTT. B2B sent it to transform service where there are transforms which will convert this document to canonical, and then on that canonical post-processing transform will happen. So to that canonical additional information will be added, such as process network and so on. And then what it does is there would be an object created that will have this value of B2B transaction type. So you see there is this first part. The other part at this point of time is empty. There is no information in this part as of now. Yeah, so this is the base that got created. Now this transaction request is sent into, and this what you see here is your MPC application, which is doing all of this, right? So that's why, remember, we kept talking about that B2B part is supposedly going to be common for all the business application, right? So B2B does its part and it hands over the object to the business application, which is Mint in this case. So the transaction request flows into another application called transaction workflow runtime. Now this is the application, and again, this is a system application, that is something happening in the backend. Now this is the application which is handling all those states that we talked about, right? So from prepare inbound to process inbound to prepare outbound and so on. So that app is handling these stages, and we'll see how this handles the stages as well. And also during appropriate times, it will keep on getting the data and copying the data into the database as well. So all the transaction related data during the different TWR stages will keep getting copied into the databases. Okay, S3 and the other databases. Now, what happens is if a transaction is initiated from the B2B, the prepare inbound stage happens where the data is copied, and then the process inbound stage is where the actual transaction information that was present in the canonical, it is converted into what is called as business transaction object, right? So canonical to BTO transform or subtype transform. And this is the information that you see available on the user interface, right? So this information, so there is a transformation step that happens on the file which converted it to the canonical. And there are internal transforms available for converting this canonical to the BTO or subtype, which application uses to show data on the Mint. So there is one actual canonical, then there is another transform available, which are JavaScript transforms, and sometimes called as JSLTs. So there are JSLTs transforms available, which will map the canonical fields into the UI fields, right? So fields from canonical would be mapped to the UI field, and that is the information that you will see available on the user interface. And then the outbound of it would be provided to the outbound stage, and then the outbound part progresses from here. That all the conversion has happened, canonical is received, data is displayed on the user interface, and then from user interface, the outbound part starts. Now, this is all happening through these workflow stages that you are seeing here. Okay. So process inbound sends the data outbound to the outbound side B2B, receiver side system, and then B2B processes it, transforms it, and post-processing transform is not required here. It is only required if the receiver also has Mint licensed. Okay. And if there is a failure on the outbound side, you can of course do a retrigger. Okay. So again, no need to remember the diagram exactly, but this is what is happening in the backend, and we will get more information about JSLTs, why that is important, and so on. Now, these are the core steps. Prepare inbound, right? So as we said, we'll get the data, we'll store the canonical in S3, and then something happens, like we store the database. Now, when you have to refer to the object, you don't actually refer to the S3 file, you refer a link to that S3 place, right? And then process inbound. So process inbound uses the transforms, the other transforms that I was talking about, the JSLT transform, to generate the UX representation of the document. Okay. So there was a document that was sent. There were many fields. From that fields, we'll take out the values which we'll place on the user interface into different attributes. And then prepare outbound, we create canonicals. Now, there are cases where we'll create more than one canonical, but that we'll see later. And then process outbound, then given the data, we will create the outbound stages. And we'll see that earlier. So what sort of process outbound stages are there? And then conclude outbound is when the processing is completed. Now, one of the benefits to break this whole flow into different steps is we have a lot of flexibility that at which state, if we want to do something additional, some additional work, we can do that additional work in these stages as well, right? So for example, as you know, you send a transaction, it goes through all the stages and gets delivered outbound. But let's say if we want to pause a transaction and then allow user to edit it, we can go to one of these stages and write a code in TWR which says that once the transaction reaches to this stage, wait for some action. Okay. And only when that action completes, then go to the next stage. So those are sort of flexibilities that this can provide us. You send one inbound transaction and one outbound transaction gets delivered. But what if I want from one inbound transaction, and these are examples, right? So there can be many other examples, but what from one inbound, I want to generate two different outbounds or same outbounds or whatever. I want to generate two outbounds, which I want to send to two different systems. And this is actual customer use case, right? So you can go there and before the file gets delivered outbound, the transaction gets delivered outbound, you can write a piece of code which says that while you are sending to this receiver, send it to the other receiver as well. So those are sort of flexibilities that it provides that can be added to the system based on the requirement. Yeah, so this particular example was one-to-many. Yes, the last example. Okay. And no matter how much I try to remember, I always forget the BTPS full form. But just think of it from services perspective. Just think of it as a sort of a code, right? There is a code that is running, and what it does is, as you see from the diagram, a transaction comes in, it goes to different stages. So the stages start with, so a prepare inbound message. There is some work that happens on this one, and the response is being written to the prepare inbound response, and it goes to the same transaction workflow system, and it keeps on saving the data into databases. So different stages, the transaction will go through different information that it might add, and all the information will be written to the respective databases. That's what the diagram is trying to tell, right? And these are all the stages that will get completed for a transaction before it gets delivered outbound. So it goes through all these different stages. So once you start testing your transactions, many a times you will see when you refresh the screen or click on the screen, it will show you that it is some sort of stage before it is getting delivered or sent outbound. It will show you different stages. So this is what it means, that it is going through all those different stages, doing its work, and then it passes that stage, saves that data, moves on to the next stage, and so on. Okay. And this is important to understand because when you will send the transaction on the user interface, you will see all these different stages happening. Okay. Now, as we talked about what happens with the object that was created. So object, starting of the object that got created is with the B2B detail. So first of all, B2B generates or creates an object or base information, or Mint creates an object based on a particular B2B transaction. Then all this different information. So when you start the prepare inbound stage, transaction detail gets added into the base type. And then in the process inbound stage, all the other subtype attribute also get populated. So this is the whole object that you get, right? What does this mean is every entry that you see on business transaction, all transaction screen, a purchase order, a ASN or invoice, or any entry that you see here, that is one object, right? That was one B2B connection and one object, and it will have all these characteristics with it. So it will have B2B transaction details. It will have the transaction detail itself. It will have the UI attributes as well. Okay. So that is why those of you who have been working with the teams on troubleshooting issues and all, you would be able to relate now. Most of the time when you create an issue, Mint team asks you for to provide an object ID, right? So that object ID is your transaction that got created and the ID of this transaction. If Mint team gets this, that means they get the transaction detail right from it was sent to B2B and what was created during the different stages, right? So let's say you send a PO transaction, it fails on the user interface, you want to troubleshoot it, right? You've done your initial troubleshooting and now you want engineering team to troubleshoot it. What you will do is you will provide that ID. You'll go to that transaction, click on that transaction. It will provide an object ID to you. That is the ID of this object that gets created, which has all the information about the transaction itself. And using that, team will be able to troubleshoot it. We'll discuss that in detail when we start discussing the troubleshooting steps and all, but this is important for you to know that this is what an object means on Mint. An object means a transaction that you see on your B2B all transaction B2B screen. Whatever you see under the left-hand side submenu after all transactions, so the actual message details are the UI attributes or the subtypes, right? So there are two parts that you see there. All transaction screen shows you the base type or base object, and the specific transaction detail shows you the subtype for that transaction. Okay, so let me complete this first. And there might be errors as well. So what this slide means is during all these processing stages, there might be some issues because of which there might be an error. So if that error occurs, the transaction workflow runtime system will pause the transaction and return the error message from that particular stage, and rest of the stages will not be executed. So for example, if at the prepare inbound stage there is an error, transaction workflow runtime will return that error, transaction will be paused, and it will not go to the other stages that exist, right? And then this is the same example that we were talking about, that how the transaction workflows are flexible, that if we want to send multiple outbound message, we can configure the workflows to do exactly that. We can configure the workflow to work in most of the cases in any method that we want to. The standard pattern is, the standard pattern. You send a transaction in and transaction goes to all the stages if there are no errors, and it gets processed outbound. So there are not a lot of things to discuss on this slide as well. Now, assuming the transaction has gone to Mint, right? It went through different stages. So now if all of you who have been doing the hands-on and you sent a transaction during the last call, right? If now you navigate to your Mint screen, you should be able to see the transaction on the Mint UI. And depending on whichever stage that you see here, it means your transaction has reached to that Mint stage. Okay, so let me do this. Let me also log into my system and show you one of the transaction. Maybe I'll show you the successful one and failed one. Just give me a second. I can share my screen again. You can see my open screen, right? Okay. Okay, so I go to the business transaction screen. Okay. These are the different objects. All the entries that we see here are the different objects. Now you'll see the first column called state. So these are your workflow processing states, right? These are the results. Type is your transaction type, transaction number, sender, receiver, input and output file, and so on. Now, whatever you saw on the transaction workflow runtime slides, these steps, the username for this exactly does not match with that, but you can find the username if I don't have OSC in my disk system. Otherwise, I could just pull those names. So this represents a different step. So the processing one that you see here, the transaction stopped at processing itself. It could not do anything else after processing, right? The processing step is prepare inbound step. So the transaction was failed at prepare inbound step itself. The first one that you see here. Now this transaction that you see here, sent, this is a transaction, and you can also see delivered, type, input, output file. If I click on this one, this is the transaction which has gone through all the stages. So it went from processing, process, preparing to send, sending to send. And these are your prepare outbound, conclude outbound, prepare outbound, process outbound, conclude outbound. This is your process inbound, prepare inbound, and so on. Again, those steps that you saw there, they have just been given a nice customer facing names, right? So this is essentially the same thing. You see process status is done. You see the transaction ID, you see the inbound status. So there was a document, there was input file, there was a canonical created, there was a transform which was used to create canonical, right? And there were no exceptions. And then you will see similarly for outbound status, then you will see the transaction has been successful outbound as well. Now this is one object, okay? Because this is one transaction that I see on the user interface. It has all the details, right, on the page itself. And if you go to the subtype page, this is where the subtype page, I don't have the correct rules to see it. I mean, this user, if you have correct role, you will also be able to see all the details of this PO transaction as well. Okay. Now there is one more transaction or one more object that got created, and now it is stuck in processed mode. Process means you prepare inbound, and this is your process inbound stage. So inbound has happened, but while processing the inbound, there was some sort of error. So if I click on that, or because of something, it stopped. So you can see process status is error, and it was stuck here. Okay, it could not go further. And to me, it just says that the document was received only. Now, these can be called as sort of what we call errors for which we don't have the error messages readily available. But if you can go look into the logs, you will find some sort of error message where it will say because of this field, the transaction got stuck, right? In future, all those error messages will be available on the user screen as well. I mean, whichever are not available, not all of them are available as of today, but all of them will be in future. But this is what a transaction means. So your transaction is in error stage. It failed into process inbound stage because of some issue. Now, if I want to troubleshoot this particular transaction, there are two ways. Again, I don't expect you to remember all this, but still, I will just let you know, if you have been working on Mint for some time, then you might remember it, and that's okay. Otherwise, we'll have instructions for all of it. This ID that you get here in the URL, after 3D and before this, and this is your object ID, business object ID. So this is the only ID. If you get it, you go to the logs, put this ID, you will get all the logs line. What happened with the transaction, which all modules it went through, where did it was stuck, and so on. Okay, but again, we can discuss that on different session, troubleshooting session, and so on. This is just to let you know that this is what represents an object that you see here. Okay. Now, all those of you who have tried the transaction last time, you would see some sort of state for your transaction on your process network, right? You might see processed, you might see sent, and so on. What is a successful transaction? A successful transaction is the one. And then again, before saying the successful transaction, what it means is you send a file from an external system inbound, it gets converted, transformed into different format and delivered outbound to the receiver, right? That is my use case. Now there might be different use cases. There might be use cases where someone on receiving side is not using a B2B system at all, right? So what they can do is they will just log into the UI and download the output file from the here. Now that is one use case. So in this use case where we think that we will drop a file from external system and it will get delivered to another external system, a successful transaction is where you could see this stage where inbound stages have been completed, a canonical and outbound is generated, and also the outbound status is completed, an output file and outbound canonical is generated with the transform name. So if in your test companies, those who have been following along, you see this inbound and outbound statuses, it means your transaction was successful end to end. And if you go to the receiver's SFTP system in the outbox folder, because the outbound transaction will go to the outbox folder, you should be able to see these files, right? That is what a successful test will do. And from there, the expectation for customer use case would be the customers will pick the file from their outbox folder and process it into their ERPs. Okay. If for some reason, so there might be multiple things. You might see that this part is successful and you might see nothing on this part. That might be one scenario. There might be a scenario where this one failed, so we can check that as well. But on the outbound side, the part is successful, but then you see some error on the delivery side. So you can just click on this line, click on the eye icon and see the error details as well. Okay. So that is something that you will be able to see. Or there might be some other errors which we might not know about as of now, but because we have not configured the receiving system so far. Okay. We only configured in these sessions the sending system. We have not configured the receiving system. There might be some things that you must have done on your receiving system on your own that might cause this transaction to get delivered successfully. But if you've been just doing what you are doing on this call, then on the receiving side, you either might face some error or there will not be any error, but you will not see the output file getting generated. Okay. Thanks, Sonan. Okay. Now, if that is the case, then we know what happened when we sent the inbound. And I assume people who've been following along, they have been able to make the inbound successful, right? We discussed inbound. And if you were using the same file that we had shared in the last call, then there should not be any other errors on Mint itself, because that file ensures that all the values are correctly mapped with the user interface and so on. So there should not be any issues related to that file for inbound processing. On the outbound side, but we'll have to see what happens when Mint tries to deliver a transaction outbound. Okay. Because now Mint part is over and Mint will now send the file outbound to the partners system where it is partners XTT that needs to be configured, or B2B system that needs to be configured. So if those configurations are correct, our transaction should be successful. So first of all, can some of you who have been trying hands-on, can you just let me know what is the status here on the outbound side? Success, fail, no status, anything is fine on the outbound side if you have. Just put it on the chat if you can, and that's okay, so that when we start discussing it, we can discuss what are we going to do next. And what I will do is I will go to the one of the partner systems. Now, and this is partner for my test company, but for your company, it would be the same thing. Okay. So if Mint part is successful, then what happens on the outbound side? And then now we'll talk about B2B outbound processing steps. We talked about B2B inbound processing steps in the last call, but now we are going to talk about B2B outbound processing steps. Okay. So Mint part is over. Now what happens is the first thing that B2B needs to check for the partner system is the delivery rule, right? So what delivery rule says is there was a sender, Mint in between, and there is a partner. Now on the partner side, what should happen with the file that it received from Mint, right? So there are three delivery rules. One is called no processing, which means you just receive the document, you don't process it, right? Document will be returned to business application. That no processing is only used for service to service application because the file stays in canonical mode. And if this is a service to service use case where Mint 1 is talking to Mint 2, that happens through canonicals, right? You don't need transform data. So no processing, transform only. The option of transform only, what it does is it will take the outbound canonical that was delivered from the Mint and run a transform on the receiver system, which is an outbound transform. And then once the outbound file is generated, it will just stop there. It will not attempt to send it to any B2B connection because your option says transform only. It will just transform the file into an outbound format and just stop, right? So what happens is that outbound file will be available on the user interface and receiver can log into their system, go to the process network, click on the file and download that file manually. So that's the transform only option. The last option is called, which is the most used option, is called transform and deliver. So if this option is set up for a particular transaction, then what receiving system will do is it will receive the outbound canonical, transform and convert it to the correct format and then deliver to correct B2B connection. So now let me go back to my company and show you. This is my partner company. Okay. If I go to B2B integration page, now remember, I am under administration. Administration is an enterprise application. So I am under my partner's administration application. So these settings that I'm seeing here are for my company. So what I see here is the owner of the process network. For me, the direction, and you can ignore this should say my company's name, but right now it is not there. What happens on the outbound side for these two messages, MPC serial shipment notice and MPC purchase order notice? If I click on edit, I'll be able to see what delivery rules have been configured for this message. So, okay. one correction is, in case of partners, we still have this dependency that the delivery rules cannot be set up from the partner side. And this will only be solved with the upcoming administration Gen 2 release. So let me go back to the owner side. And this is a shared object. Since owner has created a link with the partner, owner can also set it up. So similar to this one, you should see it on the partner side also when Gen 2 is out. So the owner of the network is this company. This is my partner. I have set up outbound configurations for them. And if I go here, I can see for serial shipment notice, I'm saying transform and deliver the document. For purchase order, I'm saying transform and deliver the document. So as long as I have sent purchase order document, it should get transformed and delivered to the outbound side to the receiver, right? That is the first step for the system to check for the outbound message settings. Now, those who are following, doing hands-on, you go to your owner company, you can go to your owner company, go to B2B integration, inbound, outbound message setting. You will find an entry created for your partner for your process network, right? Because you are the owner, you will see your own process network and you'll find an entry there. And then you will be able to configure that as well. Okay, so let me go back to my slide again. So that was the option for delivery rule. So you can set up the delivery rule for the partner from the owner side. Okay. The next stage that the outbound file will go to would be the route determination, what route it should follow. So the routing happens based on the, again, the settings that you do under B2B integration, right? So remember when we sent the transaction inbound, at that time, there were 3 network nodes that were identified: sender network node, receiver network node, and owner network node, right? Now the same file has not been modified so far. It is the same transaction that has been flowing. So this transaction will have the receiving network node ID as well. Now, when on the outbound side, B2B wants to find out, the transformation would happen later, but B2B wants to find out that which B2B connection the document should be routed to. Okay. So it will go to administration connection association on the partner side, and it will try and look for the outbound association. So there are multiple options for this one as well. But right now I'm in owner company, so I will not be in owner company any longer. I'll go to the partner company because now we are discussing outbound.
So this is to identify partners SFTP.
Correct. On the outbound side. So you have multiple B2B connection. You might have multiple B2B connection on the receiving side. And what you will see is, you will see that the B2B connection on the receiving side is associated to, for this example, company, the partner company for the outbound direction. Okay. If it is not already associated, then you can click on add outbound association, select the B2B connection, whichever connection you are using on partner side, and just click on add. Don't worry about the other options. We'll get into the other options in future, but not today. Okay. So B2B knows that what it has to do with the document. It has to transform the document and deliver it. Which B2B connection it has to deliver the document. This is the receiver side, and this is where you will set it up. Okay. So it has found out the B2B as well. So log into your partner company, go and select this information. Now, one more thing which I should specify here, which we discussed in the previous call, the inbound associations are created by default. As soon as you create a B2B connection, you would see an entry here for the company. The outbound associations have to be explicit. So you'll have to come and create the outbound associations here. Okay. So once you're able to do that, create the outbound, the route determination, it tells which B2B connection the message should go to. And then now, since the B2B connection is known, now you know that a transform set is associated to the B2B connection, right? Because on the receiver side, and I'm sorry for switching back and forth, but this is what I want to do, relate each and every slide with the actual system. So what we will do is go to the transform set and on the transform set screen, you will have your B2B connection associated with a transform set. Again, the steps how to associate B2B connection to transform set, how to create the transform set, these are all same steps that you have done on the owner side. There are no changes in that, right? Now, but on this side, let's just make sure that the transform that you are going to use is, and I hope I have the right one, is the IDOC format. So I can just send you that. I think the latest version is, you can use V4 also. I think so. We'll see if there are no transform related error. That should also happen. Because remember when we started our session, we said we will be sending a PO from sender side in X12 format, but on the receiver side, it will get delivered into the IDOC format, right? So we sent a PO X12 in our previous call, got converted into canonical, changed, went through all those steps of Mint. And then on the outbound side, there is an outbound transform, which will convert this canonical into the IDOC format. So same transform, everything else remains same. Only thing the direction changes from inbound to outbound and a new transform set that gets created. Okay. And you can use this transform set. Okay, so I'll pause for some time so that people who are actually doing hands-on, they can upload their transform set. One of the easiest thing of uploading transform set is if you have transform set uploaded already. Again, just a hack, you can click on export transform, the file will, all the transforms will get exported, and then you can just edit your transform name and import it in any other company where you want, right? So it would be a pretty quick thing to do. You will not have to change a lot of things, just the transform name. Okay, so what are the steps? The steps that happened on the partner side were these. So first of all, the document was sent inbound, all the processing happened. In Mint, all different those transaction workflow states were executed. And then on the outbound side, when finally the outbound canonical was generated, the first step was checked whether the what is the option for the outbound side, transform and deliver, transform only, and so on. So system found the transform and deliver option. So what it did is it went to connection association and checked on which connection I should send it if I transform it. After the connection was found, then that connection was associated with a transform set, which will convert the canonical into the outbound format. Okay. And now the file is ready. Do we all think that file is ready? Okay. So let's see if file is ready. Um, Excellent. So you can keep on completing that, and let me just open two files here. You can see the Notepad++, right?
Yes.
Okay. So these are the two files. This is my inbound format, which was X12. And this is supposed to be my outbound format, which is an IDOC. Okay. So inbound X12, outbound IDOC. Okay. Now in every transaction that you see, there are some elements which are called header elements. And there are some elements which are called the body of the document. So if you see here in this IDOC, this is the header, how a document should be read, who is the originator, who is the sender and receiver, and rest of it is a body. Okay. And same with X12 document. So most of this information that you see till here is created based on headers, and rest is body, who is the sender, who is the receiver, what is the message type, and so on. Now, when you convert one format to another format, right? There might be a way to translate these values. For example, what is the unit of measure boxes? How many 500? How many lines? One line. What is the name, and so on. And that can be converted in this format as well, because there will be an option for all these places, how many boxes and so on. Essentially, these are two different formats for sharing a common sort of message, purchase order message, right? So there might be some fields discrepancy here and there, but more or less they should look like the same, right? Ultimately, you can map these documents into each other because these are essentially a purchase order. They represent the same thing in the supply chain. What is the body? Header. Now, header tells you how your document will be processed by your system, the receiving system. On the receiver side, they might be able to process all of this, but there would also be a requirement of how the receiver system understands the document, right? How they have configured their system so that it knows if the document comes in, who has sent it, what IDs I am. So think of it like that. If the sender sends, for example, sender uses GLN to identify themselves and the partners. The receiver might not be using GLNs at all, right? They might be using company IDs to reference them and the partners. This is how both systems on the both sides will be set up. One might be using some separate set of headers. One might be using some separate set of headers. When you are sending something inbound, that is not a problem for Mint, right? Because we talked about what all we do on inbound to figure out whom to send the transaction, right? We check the sender receiver IDs and so on. That's the only thing we do, and we don't touch the document. But on the outbound side, we'll have to generate the header as well so that it can be received by the system, the receiving system, and it can also get processed into their system. Okay. So on the outbound side, we will have to also first drop the header that was in the inbound file because it is no longer applicable or no longer valid because the receiver might be using a separate format. Even think of X12. So X12 has many versions, right? So one of the versions that you will see here is this version, 008020. So sender system is using X12 version 008020. And the receiver system might be using version starting with 4 or so on, right? So that is not the actually file content. That is the header content. The file content is this: how many products you are ordering, who are you shipping to, and so on. That is the actual information. But the header information is something that would depend on the sender and receiver system separately. On the sender side, we do not worry about header information because we just consume the information and convert it to canonical. On the receiver side, we will have to create the headers. So we will have to know that if this is the IDOC, what is the identified type and value that the receiving system is expecting for this transaction. What is the identified type and value the receiver system is expecting for themselves, right? Because that might not come from the inbound file. Inbound file will be using something else and the other header information as well. Okay, so let's just focus on these two first, but then whole header has all the other elements also. Then there should be some sort of mechanism to pull these values and put it in the outbound documents header, right? So on the inbound side, we got the document, converted it, transformed it, found the sender and receiver ID, sent it to Mint. Mint did all the steps that it had to do. Send it on the outbound side. On outbound side, we found out that, okay, we need to transform and deliver it. This is the B2B connection that we need to use. This is the transform that we need to use. Now the document is almost ready, except for the header. Right? Now the important step is to create the header. Okay. And this is where our last concept for this use case, of course, comes in, which is the identifying the header information before the delivery. Okay. Okay. Now, how do we do this? How do we create header? So this is where we use on the receiver side, we use the concept of link settings. Okay. And now each and every field will matter what we put here on the receiver side. So what we'll do first. First we need to understand that the incoming document that came in had 3 values. Inbound value, because those values were identified during the inbound process. The value was sender network node ID, right? So let me call it network node ID. There was something called as receiver network node ID, and there was something called as owner network node ID. And once we did that, so how did we get these IDs? Is we read the incoming document, inbound document, and there was a sender identified type and value. There was a receiver identified type and value, and we converted from those values to IDs, network node IDs, these 36 character IDs, and now these are flowing. Now on the receiver side, the inverse will happen. So on the sender side, from identified type and value, we converted to network node IDs. On the receiver side, from network node IDs, we will convert to identified type and values. So what we'll do is go to the receiver side, click on the link settings, and then configure link setting. Now, first of all, we know on which B2B connection I want my document to get delivered outbound. That is the first thing that we'll do. Then this is where I'm selecting the network node IDs. So this is my receiver. I'll create one settings for receiver, and I'll create another setting for sender. Okay. So first of all, let's start with receiver. So this is the receiver. Now, remember when we dropped the file inbound, and I believe this was the exact file that all of us dropped with the GLN values. This was the value for the receiver. This is the GLN value. But when I'm receiving the document here, I want to use company ID. Okay. Sorry, there should not be any space. So what I did is on the inbound side, when I had used GLN type and value, my system was able to identify it with this network node. Now with this network node, I will convert it to this company ID, type and value. Okay, so that's the first part. Does that part make sense? Okay, try and so related with this document. So what we did is from the inbound side, we had ID type and values. On outbound side, we don't want same ID type and values. We want different type ID types and values on the outbound side. So how do we do that? Is on the inbound side, we converted the ID type and values to what is called as a network node ID, which is a 36-digit ID. And on the outbound side, we are taking reference of that 36-digit ID and converting it to a different identified type and value based on the receiving system requirement. Again, if someone has a question, what if they both want the same format, then you can use the same format, right? The concept still holds true. It's just that you will use the same identifier type and value here, okay? Because header will be created by this document. Now, let me select some. Yeah. Now you will see this information, which is called choreography type information. And these are the exact values that go into different fields that you see here. What should go in RCV PRN? What should go in RCV PFC field and so on. Applicable for IDOC only as of now. Depending on your connection, if it is Extrel, these choreography information will change based on what should be your EDI version. What is the sender receiver code that you want? What is the envelope RD type and value that you want? Because if you remember when we sent the file inbound, it was GLN, so 07 and GLN value. On outbound side, if you want company ID, it will have to be ZZ and company ID value, right? Those all settings will go into your B2B system. Now for this session, what if you're again following along, doing hands-on. So what you should do is just put some random values here. So our first job is to make this transaction successful and then look at the different values. And then I can give you a mapping. So you can go and see the mapping, which fields relate to which fields on the link setting relates to which field on the outbound file, and then you can correct those values also. So select some values, put some values. We need two different objects, one for partner company and one for owner company. Okay. So one for sender, one for receiver. You can put all the values here. And once you save both of these objects on the same B2B connection, now when all of this is done, you should resend your transaction from the inbound side when all the configuration steps are completed. Because when you do that, assuming all of your configuration is in place, the transaction goes through all the stages and gets delivered outbound. There is an outbound file that gets generated and you get all the information.
So this choreography type information has nothing to do with the file. We can put any data or it should be in reference to the file that you were showing.
Not the inbound file. All the data that you would put in the choreography type information will go to the outbound file. Okay. Right? So you created link settings both the sides, on the sender side as well, on the receiver side as well. But on both the side, the purpose of link setting and the data that it takes is different. That's the most important concept, right? On the sender side, you only needed one link setting only for receiver because B2B has to identify the receiver. It would not change anything into your inbound file. On the outbound setting, you create two different location settings, one for sender, one for receiver, because this data has to come from different link setting objects to the file that is getting delivered. And why they are two, right? For example, so imagine these two IDs, sender and receiver IDs. Okay. The receiver will define one type of ID for themselves in their external system. They will say, in my system, in my ERP, I refer to myself as company ID BioLink Soul. So in any file that I receive from anyone in any format, when it comes to me, the receiver ID should be converted to company ID BioLink Soul. Okay, so they created one object for themselves here, and they said, this is my, if I am referred to as a receiver, then this is the ID that will always come as RCV LED in my file. Now, for different senders, they will have different settings, right? So let's say customer A is sending them file. They will have probably their company ID, which will be called as A, for example. For customer B, they will have another company ID, which will be called as company ID B, and so on, right? And that is why you need different objects for these as well, for sender as well, so that you can put up the correct values here, right? You cannot do that all in the same object. For receiver, you can just have one. But for all senders, you must have different objects where you set up these IDs. And this is just one of the fields I'm talking about, right? So depending on which value are supposed to be set up, decided based on sender and receiver, those information will go in the link setting object. And for iDoc, at least we have a very clear mapping. For X12 also, we have relatively better mapping. For Edifact, we are working on one. I think we should be available by now. So you would know which information should go where into the outbound file. Tricky? And that is why doing it was very important. Because if you try and understand it, it might become very confusing. Okay, so doing it is very, very important to understand what is happening with your file or a transaction. Okay. All done, set. Can you guys send another transaction? Are you ready?